popcorn going off.
Popcorn.
Famously dubbed the Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne didn't just rise to fame in the 1970s, he exploded onto the scene. With a sound as fierce as his persona and a stage presence that teetered on the edge of chaos, Ozzy captivated fans and critics alike. Even if heavy metal wasn't your thing, resisting his sound was nearly impossible. From fronting Black Sabbath to a solo career filled with chart-topping hits and sold-out arenas, Ozzy built a legacy that rocked the world, literally. But time, as it does to even the wildest icons, has taken its toll. Now 76, Ozzy Osbourne lives a life few could have predicted. How Ozzy Osbourne earned the nickname the Prince of Darkness. Tragedy is a word Ozzy Osbourne knows too well. It's followed him like a shadow since childhood, ever present, quietly shaping the man. Long before the fame, the music, or the madness, Ozzy's life was marked by pain, survival, and the kind of darkness that leaves a permanent scar. He was born on December 3, 1948, at Maternity Hospital in Marston Green, and raised in the rough, working-class neighborhood of Aston in Birmingham. His family of 8 lived in a cramped two-bedroom home at 14 Lodge Road. His mother, Lillian, worked at a Lucas factory, and his father, Jack, worked night shifts as a toolmaker for General Electric. Money was tight, space was tighter, and comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford. Young John Michael Osbourne, nicknamed Ozzy, struggled in school, battling dyslexia and the ridicule that came with it. His thick Brummie accent made him stand out even more. But it wasn't just teasing. At the age of 11, Ozzy suffered sexual abuse at the hands of school bullies, an experience that haunted him for the rest of his life. By his teens, he had already attempted suicide multiple times, drowning in depression and hopelessness. At 15, Ozzy left school and took on a string of dead-end jobs: construction worker, trainee plumber, horn tuner at a car factory, and even slaughterhouse laborer. By 17, he had a criminal record after being caught robbing a clothes shop. With no money to pay the fine and a father unwilling to bail him out, Ozzy spent 6 weeks behind bars in Winson Green Prison. It was cold, brutal, and sobering, but it didn't break him. Amid all this chaos, one moment changed his world forever. At 14, Ozzy heard the Beatles' "She Loves You" for the first time, and something clicked. For the first time, he saw a path out. In that sound, in that energy, he found escape, hope, and a future. "I knew I was going to be a rock star for the rest of my life," he later said in the 2011 documentary God Bless Ozzy Osbourne. Despite his pain, despite the odds, Ozzy didn't let tragedy define him. Instead, he used it as fuel. And in time, that troubled boy from Aston would become one of rock's most unforgettable icons. The birth of Black Sabbath. Ozzy's path to Black Sabbath wasn't some fairy tale. It was messy, improvised, and full of misfires, just like the man himself. In late 1967, Geezer Butler pulled together a band called Rare Breed and brought Ozzy in as the frontman. They played 2 shows. That was it. The whole thing collapsed. But Ozzy and Butler weren't done. They tried again, this time with guitarist Tony Iommi and drummer Bill Ward, forming a band called Polka Tulk Blues Band. The name didn't stick, and neither did the sound. They dropped members, rebranded as Earth, and kept gigging. Then came a gig mix-up. They were booked under the name Earth, only to find out another band already had it. It was time to change again. They needed something heavier, something that fit the kind of music they were drifting toward: loud, slow, and bleak. Inspired by an old horror film, they landed on Black Sabbath. It was a perfect fit. Ozzy wasn't writing about sunshine and love. This was music about fear, death, and the dark side of life. And people couldn't look away. Their first self-titled album came in 1970, The label barely invested in it, but it didn't matter. Built around Iommi's crushing riffs, Butler's occult-tinged lyrics, and Ozzy's strange, almost haunted vocals, it made noise. Big noise. Then came Paranoid, and suddenly Black Sabbath wasn't just a band, they were a movement. While the band was blowing up, Ozzy met someone who'd eventually change everything, Sharon Arden. She worked as a receptionist for her father, the infamous manager Don Arden. Sabbath was thinking about switching management, and Don was on their radar. Ozzy didn't care about the deal, he was just glad to have a reason to see Sharon. By 1971, Sabbath was releasing Master of Reality. Critics hated it. Lester Bangs from Rolling Stone called it doggerel. But it didn't matter. The fans loved it, and the record went gold fast. The same pattern followed. Bad reviews, huge sales. Vol 4 in 1972, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath in 73. That last one finally got the critics on board. Ozzy was still Ozzy, but the band were maturing, pushing their sound, adding layers, getting stranger. In 1975, Sabotage dropped. Some said it was their best yet. But behind closed doors, things were getting weird. Too many drugs, too much tension. Ozzy was slipping. The bond between the band was cracking, and it showed. The 1976 album Technical Ecstasy was proof, confused, cleaner, lacking bite. Critics shrugged. Fans were unsure. And inside the band, something was breaking. Ozzy Osbourne's substance abuse. Ozzy Osbourne is arguably the most legendary rock star Birmingham has ever produced. But while Ozzy's music career brought fame, sold-out shows, and awards, the man behind the music lived in constant battle with drugs, alcohol, and himself. After parting ways with Black Sabbath in 1979, Ozzy launched a solo career that took him to even greater heights. He released 13 studio albums, sold millions of records, and was later inducted into the UK Music Hall of Fame. But behind all the success was a long, public struggle with addiction. Ozzy has openly admitted that drugs and alcohol controlled most of his adult life, nearly ruining everything he ever built. His addiction story starts early. In 1971, Ozzy was first introduced to cocaine, and at that moment, everything changed. Before then, he had already been drinking and experimenting, but cocaine took things to a whole new level. From that point, he began to live in a blur. The addiction was so deep that he later said he couldn't even remember when his two younger children, Kelly and Jack, were born. But that's not all. During this time, Ozzy's life was wild, loud, and full of chaos, just like his music. In 1972, Black Sabbath was recording Vol 4 in Los Angeles. They were staying in a mansion in Bel Air and doing drugs by the truckload. Ozzy later joked, "We lived in a house, rehearsed there, did loads of drugs, and made an album. Simple. But those good times came with a heavy price." Ozzy recalled how, in America, people liked to secretly spike drinks with LSD. At first, he didn't mind. He even bragged about taking entire handfuls of tabs. But one day, things got out of hand. After returning to England, Ozzy took 10 tabs of acid and went for a walk in a field. What happened next became one of the most ridiculous stories in rock history. He claimed he spent an hour talking to a horse, only for the horse to turn around and say, "F asterisk, 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 off." That moment made Ozzy swear off LSD for good. But not all the stories were funny. Some were just disturbing. According to Black Sabbath's guitarist Tony Iommi, Ozzy once pulled a live shark through a hotel window, dismembered it, and soaked their room in blood. No explanation, no reason. Just drugs, boredom, and madness. That same year, Ozzy and the rest of the band had wanted to name their album Snowblind, a reference to their constant cocaine use. The label said no, but the message was clear. Black Sabbath was flying high, literally. Of all the band members, Bill Ward, the drummer, got the worst of the group's drug-fueled pranks. In one unforgettable story, Ozzy and Bill were peeing side by side when Ozzy grabbed a random aerosol can and sprayed it on Bill's genitals. Bill started screaming and collapsed. Ozzy checked the can. It read, "Warning, do not spray on skin, highly toxic." He had just poisoned his bandmate. In Ozzy's own version of the story, told in his 2009 autobiography, I Am Ozzy, he tried to pin it on Tony. But whether it was Ozzy or Tony, Bill ended up blacking out and rolling down a hill with a chemically burnt private part. And then there was the infamous meeting with Brian Wilson, the genius behind the Beach Boys. In 1983, after playing at Madison Square Garden, Ozzy went to a club in an old church. There, he and his crew were in a private room, snorting coke and drinking. Someone came up to him and asked if he wanted to take a photo with Brian Wilson. Ozzy, high and annoyed, said, "Who the f*** is Brian Wilson?" Eventually, he agreed to take the picture. But Wilson took too long to arrive. Ozzy got impatient. When they finally met on the stairs, Wilson reached out to shake his hand. What happened next is shocking. According to Sharon Osbourne, Ozzy greeted him with, "Hello, Brian, you fasterisk inga asterisk hole. I'm glad to hear your brother's dead." Brian's brother, Dennis Wilson, had drowned just a week earlier. But these weren't just isolated moments. They were part of a pattern, one that showed how deep Ozzy had fallen into addiction. The worst example came in the 1980s, when Ozzy did something truly horrifying. In an interview with The Scotsman in 2007, he confessed that, during a drug-fueled breakdown, he unalived all 17 of the family's cats. Yes, 17. This wasn't the Prince of Darkness anymore. This was a man completely consumed by his demons. And yet, somehow, Ozzy survived. He went to rehab many times. He relapsed many times, but he kept trying. Through all of this, Sharon Osbourne remained by his side, sometimes as his manager, sometimes as his wife, and sometimes as the only person who could snap him back to reality. In later interviews, Ozzy has reflected on these dark years with brutal honesty. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't blame the fame. He says plainly, "I was addicted. I was out of control. I should not be alive." Ozzy is still alive, still standing, and somehow still performing. His body has suffered multiple surgeries, tremors, nerve damage, but his legacy is untouchable. For a man who spent half his life on drugs, the fact that he's lived into his 70s is nothing short of a miracle. The stories are insane, the behavior unforgivable at times, but that's Ozzy. His life has always been a mix of comedy and tragedy, genius and madness, success and self-destruction. He's not a role model, he's a warning, a survivor, and an icon all at once. But the only reason Ozzy has managed to survive and bounce back from all the relapses and the addiction has been because of the woman who has been by his side through it all, Sharon Osbourne. The woman that has been holding Ozzy Osbourne down. Ozzy Osbourne lived his life on stage like a man constantly flirting with death. Drugs, destruction, and deafening music followed him everywhere. But behind the scenes, his personal life was just as loud, messy, and painful. At the center of it all stood two women, one who became a regret, and another who somehow survived it all. It started in 1971 at a Birmingham nightclub called the Rum Runner. Ozzy walked in and met a woman named Thelma Riley. They got married that same year. Soon after, they welcomed two children, Jessica and Louis, and Ozzy also adopted Elliot, Thelma's son from a previous relationship. The relationship, however, was doomed from the start. Years later, He would call it a terrible mistake. At the time, Black Sabbath was taking off. Ozzy was on the road constantly, and when he wasn't touring, he was drinking, snorting, or simply gone. The kids barely saw him. In fact, he admitted in a documentary decades later that he couldn't even remember when Jessica and Louis were born. His own children would grow up saying they didn't really have a father. Just a chaotic figure that drifted in and out, buried in substances and sound. That part of his life began to collapse in 1979. Black Sabbath had had enough of Ozzy's drug use and fired him. What followed was a period of dark isolation, where Ozzy shut himself in a hotel room, lost in a haze of booze and pills. And then came Sharon. She was just 18 when they first met in 1970. Her father, Don Arden, managed Black Sabbath. Back then, Sharon was just the manager's daughter. But almost a decade later, she returned into Ozzy's life like a storm. She pulled him out of that hotel room, helped him sober up enough to stand again, and convinced him to start a solo career. She became his manager, and eventually, something more. By the time Ozzy's divorce from Thelma was finalized in 1982, Sharon and Ozzy were already in love. They married that same year. Together, they had 3 children: Amy in 1983, Kelly in 1984, and Jack in 1985. Of the 3, Amy chose the quiet life, stepping away from the media circus. Kelly and Jack, however, leaned right into it, just like their parents. But Ozzy never really escaped his demons. Not long after their marriage, Sharon faced something no spouse should ever have to. In 1989, after years of drug use, Ozzy lost control completely. One night, while under the influence, he attempted to strangle her. Sharon later described the moment in chilling detail. He had looked at her and said that he had made up his mind. She had to go. The police were called. He was arrested and sent to rehab. Charges were never pressed. Sharon simply called it what it was, the result of a man who had gone completely insane from drink and drugs. Despite everything, they stayed together. Their marriage was rocky and unstable, but rooted in something even chaos couldn't shake. In the early 2000s, they took that storm into the public eye with The Osbournes, a reality show that opened the doors into their loud, wild, and strangely relatable household. The show was a hit. Audiences loved it. But not everyone joined in. Amy, their eldest daughter, chose not to be part of it. She didn't want the cameras. She didn't want the chaos. After 4 seasons, the show ended, but life off-camera wasn't any less dramatic. Around 2013, rumors of a divorce began to swirl. Ozzy had relapsed. Again. This time, he took to Facebook to clear the air. He confessed that he'd been drinking and using again for over a year, and that he'd been a nightmare to his family. But he also added that he was now 44 days sober, and they were not getting divorced. Those words didn't last long. In 2016, the marriage hit another wall. Sharon and Ozzy separated. The cause wasn't a relapse. It was an affair. News broke that Ozzy had been unfaithful. The public didn't know just how deep the betrayal went, but Sharon did. They had been together for over 3 decades. Still, she forgave him. Publicly. Trust, she said, would take time to rebuild. But she couldn't imagine her life without him. Shortly after the reconciliation, the full story began to unfold. Michelle Pugh, Ozzy's hairstylist, revealed they had been involved for 4 years. She insisted she wasn't chasing money or fame, claiming Ozzy had pursued her. Meanwhile, Sharon opened up in interviews, saying that the affair wasn't just a fling, it was one of many. Ozzy, now in therapy for sex addiction, admitted the truth. His relationship with Michelle wasn't love, it was an empty distraction. His representatives even issued a formal apology, not just to Michelle, but to the other women involved. Because, yes, there were others. The count, according to Sharon, stood at 6, a Russian teenager, a UK masseuse, their US cook, the personal masseuse. Sharon had found out in the most unexpected way. Ozzy accidentally sent her an email meant for one of the women. When she confronted him, he denied sending it, until she grabbed his phone and saw the truth with her own eyes. Even after all of this, they didn't break. In 2017, they renewed their vows. Ozzy admitted his mistakes. Sharon spoke of the pain but also the strength it took to forgive. She said she had been married to him for too long to imagine life any other way. And this time, they started over. In the years that followed, they slowed down. Vacations replaced tours. Family dinners replaced stage dives. Sharon made peace with her past. And Ozzy, still eccentric, still sharp-tongued, reflected more than ever before. They celebrated 40 years of marriage, not as a perfect couple, but as survivors of a storm most wouldn't have weathered. In 2023, they launched the Osbournes podcast, bringing the family back into the public space, but on their own terms. This time, even Amy joined in. The once private daughter now sat beside her parents and siblings, sharing stories that once lived in whispers and tabloids. It was a full-circle moment, one no one saw coming. And then, in July 2025, the final curtain call came. Ozzy officially said goodbye to Liv, performing after 5 decades on the stage. His body, broken by time and the choices of youth, could no longer keep up, but the voice remained. So did the story. It's not clean, it's not pretty, but it's real. Ozzy Osbourne was never the model husband, not even close. But through overdoses, rehab, arrests, cheating, scandals, and even attempted murder, Sharon stayed. She held the line. She took the hits. She left when she needed to and came back when she chose to. Their marriage wasn't built on romance. It was built on survival, and somehow that was enough. For the longest time, people have believed that it was only Sharon that helped bring Ozzy out of a dark place. But people couldn't be more wrong. The plane crash that changed Ozzy Osbourne's life. By 1982, Ozzy Osbourne was no longer the lost man who'd been kicked out of Black Sabbath. His solo career was thriving, fueled by renewed purpose and a powerful musical partnership with a young guitar prodigy named Randy Rhoads. The chaos of his past had been momentarily tamed, until one morning in Florida when everything changed. It had taken work, intense work, for Ozzy to get back on his feet. After being fired from Black Sabbath in 1979 for his spiraling drug use, many in the industry had written him off. According to Sharon Osbourne, who would later become his wife, Ozzy had hit a place where he was considered a lost cause. Getting booted from one of the biggest rock bands in the world felt like the final blow. But Sharon wasn't ready to let him fall apart. She took over as his manager, offering him a shot at reinvention. Still, even with her support, something was missing. That missing piece showed up when Ozzy met Randy Rhoads. From the start, there was a spark. Ozzy would often describe Rhoads as a gift, saying he instantly knew the young guitarist was something special. The connection wasn't just musical, it was emotional. The two had a bond that felt like fate, and Randy quickly became more than just a bandmate. He was Ozzy's creative lifeline. Working together, they created something electrifying. As Ozzy once put it, Randy gave him hope. He had patience and a way of getting the best out of the people around him. For Sharon, the change was obvious. She described Ozzy before Randy as lost and numb, and after meeting him, suddenly alive again. Randy, she said, brought humor, ambition, and purpose back into their lives. With her managing the business and Randy guiding the music, Ozzy found himself climbing back to the top. They were selling out shows, creating hits, and living the rock star life on the road. But all of that would come to a devastating halt on March 19, 1982. The band had just finished a gig in Knoxville, Tennessee, and were en route to Orlando, Florida, for another show alongside Foreigner. They stopped to rest at a mansion in Leesburg. By noon, what should have been another ordinary day on tour turned into a nightmare. Ozzy and Sharon were asleep in the back of the tour bus when a massive blast jolted them awake. Ozzy would later say that, at first, it felt like he was dreaming. A blaze outside, people screaming, confusion everywhere. Sharon remembered bassist Rudy Sarzo shouting at everyone to get off the bus. When she stepped outside, she saw their tour manager collapsed on his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Then she saw it, an aeroplane lodged in the side of a house. It was only then the terrible truth sank in. On board that plane had been 25-year-old Randy Rhoads, 36-year-old pilot Andrew Aycock, and 58-year-old hairdresser Rachel Youngblood. All three were dead. Accounts from the day suggest the plane had been taken out for a joyride. There are still questions around what exactly happened, but one thing remains certain. It came dangerously close to hitting the bus. A few feet lower, and the entire band might have died that morning. Ozzy was crushed. His grief was all-consuming. For days, he wandered in a fog of disbelief, unable to accept what had happened. Losing Randy, he said, was like losing a piece of himself. The weight of it stayed with him, and it never really left. He spiraled again, numbing the pain the only way he knew how, through alcohol and drugs. Sharon, who had already been trying to save him from himself, suddenly had to work even harder just to keep him alive. For Ozzy, the guilt became a permanent fixture. He often replayed the scene in his head. If only he had been awake earlier. If only he had stopped Randy from getting on the plane. If only things had gone just a little differently. Sharon once said that even decades later, Ozzy still carried that guilt like a ghost he couldn't shake. From that moment on, every show became a tribute. Every note played felt like a whisper of the friend he lost. And even though Ozzy would go on to decades of music, fame, and reality TV stardom, Randy's death remained the dividing line in his life, the before and the after. In interviews years later, Ozzy would recall that day with a haunting clarity. The day Randy Rhoads died, he said, was the day a part of him died too. It's hard to imagine what might have been if the plane never left the ground. Randy was just 25, already being hailed as one of the greatest guitarists of his generation. Together, he and Ozzy could have redefined an era of rock. Instead, their time was cut tragically short. Still, Randy's legacy lives on, not just in the music, but in the man Ozzy became afterward. The pain never left, but neither did the memory. For Ozzy, Randy wasn't just a guitarist. He was the light at the end of a dark tunnel, the friend who reminded him what it felt like to be alive again, and the voice of reason in a world ruled by excess. And though the world knows Ozzy Osbourne as the wild, unfiltered Prince of Darkness, there's always been that quieter truth beneath it all. The boy who lost his friend in a field in Florida and never really healed from it. Losing Randy left a scar that never truly faded. And though Ozzy kept going, album after album, tour after tour, something inside him was forever changed. Time marched on, but the years weren't always kind. The wild lifestyle, the years of touring, and the weight of grief eventually caught up with him. And now, the same man who once seemed larger than life is facing battles no stage could ever prepare him for. How does Ozzy Osbourne live now? Recent health battles. Ozzy Osbourne had spent more than 5 decades commanding the stage with a presence that was equal parts chaos, charisma, and pure electric energy. From his days as the frontman of Black Sabbath to his solo stardom, he became one of the most unforgettable figures in rock history. But by 2020, the once invincible Prince of Darkness was forced to slow down, not by choice, but by the toll life had taken on his body. In 2020, Ozzy revealed what many fans had long suspected. He had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a progressive disorder that affects movement, balance, and coordination. While some might have expected him to crumble under the weight of the diagnosis, Ozzy stayed true to form. He shrugged off the panic. It wasn't a death sentence, he explained at the time. His doctors had told him that plenty of people walked around each day with the same condition and didn't even know it. For Ozzy, the early signs hadn't been obvious. There was no shaking or trembling, just a bit of odd walking. But the diagnosis was just one piece of a much bigger story. Ozzy's health had started unraveling well before Parkinson's. The first blow came in 2018, when a seemingly minor thumb infection landed him in the hospital and required surgery. Just months later, he developed a severe upper respiratory infection, forcing him to postpone the UK and European legs of his farewell tour. At the time, Ozzy released a statement saying it felt like everything he touched had turned to garbage since October. It was clear his body wasn't bouncing back the way it used to. Then came the fall. While recovering from the respiratory illness, Ozzy tripped in his Los Angeles home. The impact aggravated injuries from a 2003 ATV crash, injuries that had never truly healed. In 2019, he underwent neck surgery, canceled the rest of his shows for the year, and watched as his world slowed to a crawl. In early 2020, Ozzy sat down for an emotional interview on Good Morning America. Flanked by Sharon and their children, Jack and Kelly, he finally opened up about everything he had been hiding. Keeping his condition private had become unbearable. He wasn't good with secrets, he admitted. He couldn't keep walking around making excuses for his condition. Something had to give. Sharon was honest about what life had become. Parkinson's wasn't a death sentence, she stressed, but it was unpredictable. They'd have good days, followed by days that felt like complete collapse. For Ozzy, the most painful part wasn't even the disease itself. It was the helplessness. Coming from a working-class background, he had always been the provider. Watching his wife and children go to work every day while he sat still crushed him inside. He hated not being able to contribute to his family anymore. Despite the struggles, Ozzy kept trying. In August 2022, he stunned fans when he appeared on stage with Black Sabbath guitarist Tony Iommi at the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. It was one of the rare moments he was able to defy his condition and perform, though he'd later admit that preparing for shows now took every ounce of strength he had. Then, in 2025, he did something even more remarkable. On July 5th, Ozzy Osbourne performed for the last time, returning to Birmingham, the city where it all began. The concert, titled Back to the Beginning, was his final reunion with Black Sabbath after 20 years. Over 40,000 fans, including stars like Jason Momoa and Steven Tyler, gathered to witness a night that was never going to happen again. In the lead-up to the show, Ozzy had spoken about the enormous effort it took to get ready. He had been working with a trainer, trying to build up strength after doing virtually no physical work for 7 years. But he was determined. If God wanted him to do the show, then that's what he'd do. By hook or by crook, he was giving it everything. He couldn't stand for long. He couldn't walk unaided. So he performed the entire concert, seated on a gothic, bat-themed throne. In an interview with The Guardian, Ozzy shared that the idea had come from Sharon, who believed the show would give him a reason to wake up in the morning again. The truth was, it almost didn't happen at all. Sharon had grown tired of managing, tired of chaos, and tired of watching her husband battle one thing after another. When asked by Billboard whether this really was the final performance, she didn't leave any room for doubt. The answer was simple. They were done. She had been doing this since she was 15 years old. And now, she just wanted to live. No more strict schedules. No more tours. No more trying to keep up the pace of youth. As for Ozzy, the future wasn't something he took for granted anymore. In a Rolling Stone interview from late 2023, he had spoken candidly about his mortality. He estimated that he had maybe a decade left, if he was lucky, but he didn't sound afraid. If anything, he sounded grateful. He and Sharon had recently finished renovating their home in Buckinghamshire, and he was looking forward to returning there and spending whatever time he had left in peace. He recalled telling Sharon that they'd lived an incredible life, one filled with wild stories, chaos, success, near-death experiences, and pure magic. He didn't know why he was still alive, but he was thankful all the same. Sometimes, he felt like he was living on borrowed time. There's something poetic about Ozzy's final chapter. A man who once bit the head off a bat on stage. A man who poisoned his drummer with aerosol spray. A man who spent decades high, unpredictable, and wild, now grounded and fragile, but still, somehow, defiant. Even in a chair, on a throne, in pain, he was still Ozzy Osbourne. His final bow wasn't about perfection or performance. It was about resilience, about legacy, about showing up one last time for the fans who had stuck with him since the beginning, and maybe for himself. And now the curtain has closed. The Prince of Darkness may no longer be storming the stage, but he's still here, breathing, reflecting, loving, and finally resting. Growing up, did you watch Ozzy Osbourne play? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.